Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate
Om Namo Bhagavate
Vasudevaya.
Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Narayanam Namaskritya
Narayanam Namaskritya.
Naram Chaiva Narottamam
Jaiva Narottamam.
Devim Saraswatim Vyasam
Devim Saraswatim Vyasam.
Tato Jayamudirayet
Jayamudirahe.
Nashtaprayeshva Bhadreshu
Nashtaprayeshva Bhadreshu.
Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya
Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya.
Bhagavat Yuttama Shloke
Bhagavati Uttama Shloke.
Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki.
Bhagavati Naistiki.
So you have been studying Srimad Bhagavatam every day, I think. And in the course of your discussions, you have reached Canto 5, Chapter 1. And today is text 13. So I will be reciting this verse on my own. Since there is a time lag, if you all do it, then there will be a time lag. So I will do it on my own and you may follow privately yourselves. Text 13, the chapter is titled, The Activities of Maharaj Priyavrata. Bhavaya nashaya cha karma kartum shokaya mohaya sada bhayaya sukhaya dukkhaya cha deha yogam avyakta dishtam janatanga dhatte. Bhavaya for birth, nashaya for death, cha also, karma activity, kartum to do, shokaya for bereavement, mohaya for illusion, sada always, bhayaya for fear, sukhaya for happiness, dukkhaya for distress, cha also, deha yogam connection with a material body, avyakta by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, dishtam directed, janata the living entities, anga O Priyavrata, dhatte accept. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation. My dear Priyavrata, by the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, all living entities accept different types of bodies for birth and death, activity, lamentation, illusion, fear of future dangers, and happiness and distress. Purport. Every living entity who has come to this material world has come here for material enjoyment. But according to his own karma, activities, he must accept a certain type of body given to him by material nature under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, text 27, Prakritehi kriyamanani gunahi karmani sarvashaha. Everything is done by Prakriti, material nature, under the direction of the Supreme Lord. Modern scientists do not know why there are varieties of bodies in 8.4 million forms. The fact is that all these bodies are ordained for the living entities by the Supreme Personality of Godhead according to the living entities' desires. He gives the living entities freedom to act as they like But on the other hand, they must accept a body according to the reactions of their activities. Thus, there are different types of bodies. Some living entities have short durations of life, whereas others live for fantastic durations. Every one of them, however, from Brahma down to the ant, acts according to the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is sitting in everyone's heart. As confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 15, text 15. Please move the scroll up. Please scroll. You can move the page. Yes. I am seated in sarvasya chaham hridhi sannivishto mattah smriti jnanam apohanam cha. I am seated in everyone's heart, and from me come remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. It is not a fact, however, that the Supreme Personality of Godhead gives direction to certain living entities in one way and other living entities in another way. The truth is that every living entity has a certain desire, and the Supreme Lord gives him a chance to fulfill it. The best course, therefore, is to surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead and act according to his desire. One who does so is liberated. The translation again, please. And the verse. Yes. No, just the word for word and the translation. Yes, thank you. My dear Priyavrata, by the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, all living entities accept different types of bodies for birth and death, activity, lamentation, illusion, fear of future dangers, and happiness and distress. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kada Mahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. I am very happy to be back again with all the devotees at the Japa Sangam. And the devotees at Charlotte, North Carolina. I think devotees have gathered from various places, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, I'm very happy to be with all of you once again. And I'm very happy that you all are systematically studying the Srimad Bhagavatam verse by verse. And in the course of your study, you have reached up to the beginning of the 5th canto. In some senses, it is a very difficult canto to understand as you go into the cosmology of the universe. It is not so easy to understand certain portions. But nevertheless, we should just continue studying, reading, hearing, and Krishna very kindly will give whatever realizations that he feels necessary for our understanding of the subject. So the fifth canto actually begins because of a question asked by King Parikshit. The question pertains to the fourth canto. In the fourth canto, Srila Shukadev Goswami has described Dhruva Maharaj, the story of the sons of Swayambhuva Manu, that this actually happened for a very special reason. So now, when Swayambhuva Manu saw that there was nobody left now to continue taking care of the world, so he approached his son Priyavrata. But Priyavrata, being a disciple of Narad Muni, was more inclined to a renounced life, and therefore he was not keen at all to follow the ways of his father or to follow his instructions. Swayambhuva Manu spoke to Narad Muni. Narad Muni was not so inclined either to encourage his disciple to take to worldly life, to take charge of a kingdom and so on. But at that time, Swayambhuva Manu's father, who is also Narad Muni's father, and the guru for both of them, he agreed to Swayambhuva Manu's request, and he descended. And he descended to the planet Earth, and then he spoke to King Priyavrata. And he requested him to take responsibility for the whole kingdom. Now what we are witnessing in these series of verses is the speech of Brahma to Priyavrata. So having explained how the Supreme Lord actually is the one who is directing everything, controlling everything, and no one can escape the control of the Supreme Lord, he then speaks about how the different jivas, the living entities in the material world, are actually under the clutches of the orders of the material nature, and in this way they are indirectly under the control of the Lord. Nothing is beyond the control of the Lord. So Brahma in this verse, the 13th verse of this first chapter of the 5th canto, says that the jiva or the living entity takes different bodies in this material world under the order of the Supreme Lord for 8 things, meaning that when the jiva obtains a material body, then 8 things automatically follow in relation to the material body. So therefore, he says here, bhavaya, for the sake of bhava. Bhava means to become, that means to be born. Nashaya, nasha, for the sake of nasha, which means to be destroyed. And then Brahma says, cha karma kartum, for the sake of performing certain karma, that is activity. Shokaya, for the sake of lamentation. Mohaya, for the sake of moha or illusion. Sada bhayaya, for the sake of always being fearful, bhaya. Sukhaya dukkhaya, so for the sake of happiness and distress. Cha deha yogam, so for the jiva who has a connection, yoga means to connect, who has the connection with the deha, the material body, avyakta dishtam, who's always regulated and controlled and directed by that Supreme Lord. So janata, that means all the living entities. Anga dhatte, dhatte means to accept. So O Anga, O Priyavrata, all the living entities are forced to accept these material bodies, and then they encounter these 8 things. So then naturally the question arises, following from what Brahmaji has said to Priyavrata, now that the jiva has obtained a material body and then keeps obtaining material bodies one after the other and keeps experiencing these 8 phenomena, why does he obtain a material body in the first place. And the reason for that is given by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita also. And all devotees who have studied even some amount of Bhagavad Gita will be familiar with this idea that the jiva has descended into this world for the sake of enjoyment. In the 13th chapter, text 22, Lord Krishna says, Purusha Prakriti Sthohi Purusha Prakriti Sthohi Bhunkte Prakritir Jair Gune Karanam Guno Sangosya Sadasat Yoni Janmasu. So Purusha means actually enjoyer. Prakriti means that which is enjoyed. Now, truly speaking, there is only one Purusha, who is the Supreme Lord. However, the jiva, the living entity, who is actually Prakriti by constitution, meaning that the jiva is meant to be enjoyed by the Supreme Lord, but when that jiva falsely imagines himself to be the Purusha or an enjoyer, he is also therefore called Purusha sometimes. Although one must see the distinction that the jiva is actually the false enjoyer, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the true enjoyer. So what is it that the jiva is trying to falsely enjoy? The jiva comes into this material world because he wants to enjoy independent of the Lord. So he is given a field, he is given a certain domain in which he can try to enjoy and be an independent enjoyer. Of course, that is not possible. So all the efforts of the jiva go in vain. But nevertheless, because the desire remains very strong, the jiva is given this opportunity. So Purushaha Prakriti Sthaha. He means certainly. So therefore, the jiva, that false Purusha, is given an opportunity to be situated in Prakriti, in the material nature. Being situated in the material nature means to have a material body. To have a material body means to falsely identify with it. So the moment we have the material body and we falsely identify with it, then the troubles begin. Then we perform activity, karma kartum. And because everything in the material world is temporary, so therefore when we accept the material body and are born, and because everything is temporary, there will be death. And in between there is karma kartum, there is activity. And because we have performed karma, we are also forced or obliged to accept the reactions of our karma. So therefore there will be lamentation, because we will not always get what we want. We will often get what we don't want. And because we are in illusion, identifying with the material body falsely, and this material world is full of negative circumstances, so we become fearful. And because of the karma, sometimes we get happiness, sometimes we get distress. In this way, the jiva experiences the 8 phenomena that are mentioned by Brahma in this verse. And the root cause for that is the misuse of the independence of the jiva, of the desire of the jiva, who wants to falsely enjoy independent of the Lord. Srila Prabhupada in the purport to that verse in the Bhagavad Gita mentions that in the 2nd chapter, Krishna has spoken about how the jiva has to change bodies like we change clothes. And this happens is because we are attached to material existence. As long as one is captivated by this false material nature, one must continue to transmigrate body to body, body to body. So it is the desire to lord over this material nature that is the cause of our being put into these undesirable circumstances. Under the influence of material desire, someone is born as a demigod sometimes, or an animal or an insect sometimes as a human being. And this is because the living entity is trying to enjoy. Bhunkte prakritir jair gunair. So when the jiva tries to bhukti means the bhoga, the enjoyment. The moment the living entity tries to enjoy the material nature, then what happens? Sad asat yoni janmasu. The living entity is forced to accept one after the other different types of janma, different types of births or bodies. Some are sat, which means like a body of a demigod. Some are asat, which means the bodies of animals, insects, and so on. And then there are bodies of humans, which are mixed, which means partly sat and partly asat. So therefore, we see in the 8.4 million species of life, there are 400,000 human species. And amongst the human species, we find a variety of levels of consciousness. We find some human beings who are very much like animals. We find some human beings who are very divine in nature. And many human beings are at varying stages in between. So this verse is very important for our understanding. Prakriti, Purushaha Prakritisto hi bhunkte Prakritir Jairgunen. Karanam Gunasangosya. So the cause of this is that the living entity is identifying with the gunas, the three modes of material nature. So in this way, the jiva that is situated in the material nature is influenced by the three modes, sattva, rajas, tamas, and is pressurized or forced to act in a certain way under their influence, and thus gets different types of bodies again and again and again. Now, Srila Sridhar Swami, in the commentary to this verse, makes some interesting points. He says that actually the soul does not contact the material body, but the contact is fabricated through ignorance, that is through false ego. So the identification of the soul with the body is a fabricated one, which means it's an imaginary one. Truly speaking, the soul never comes in contact with the material body. The soul is always Satchidananda. But the soul falsely imagines itself to be the material body. Yaya sammohito jiva atmanam trigunatmakam paropi manute nartham yat kritam chapi padhyate. So, Shukadev Goswami explains also, or rather actually it's in the first canto, this verse from the 7th chapter, that the living entity is bewildered, delusioned, sammohitaha. Not only moha, which is illusion, but sammoha, which means complete illusion. So yaya sammohito jiva. So the jiva comes under complete bewilderment. Atmanam trigunatmakam, and identifies itself with this triguna, the sattva, rajas, tamas, the three modes of material nature. Manute, and it accepts anartham, the material things which are actually not useful, which are not beneficial, which are actually harmful for us. Anartham, we've heard this word anartha many times. Manute anartham yat kritam cha avipadyate. So, even though the jiva is very pure, it imagines itself through the material body and then performs various kinds of activities on the material platform and thus gets entangled. So this is a fabrication. So in other words, the soul is always aloof from the material body, but it is imagining itself to be like that. So now the question will arise. If the soul is always aloof from the material body, if the soul is always Satchidananda on one hand, and on the other hand, we see that we are constantly enjoying or suffering, mostly suffering, sometimes enjoying. So who is it that enjoys? This is a question I'm sure that comes up very often in discussions on Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. And the reason for this very valid question is this, that the soul is always Satchit Ananda, full of knowledge, full of bliss, eternal. The soul can never be suffering actually. On the other hand, the material body is dead. It is not conscious. And also there is enjoyment and suffering going on. So who is enjoying? Who is experiencing the enjoyment? Who is experiencing the suffering? So the answer, and Srila Sridhar Swami explains that in this, it is not the soul that enjoys or suffers the experiences of this world. The soul is always aloof. Then who enjoys? Who suffers? It is the mind. It is a mind that experiences these sufferings and enjoyments in this world. Then what is the soul doing? The soul is imagining itself to be the body, and then it imagines that it is suffering, much like a dream. So in a dream, we may have a bad dream sometimes, and we may suffer. We may have a good dream sometimes, and we may enjoy. But either way, it is not I who am suffering. It is a false suffering or a false enjoyment, because it is only in the dream that it is happening. Another example that may be given is of a movie. Somebody may be sitting in front of a movie, and if it is like a horror movie, then the person watching the movie will feel great fear. If there is a happy scene going on, the person watching the movie also feels happiness. If it's a very sad scene, the person watching the movie may also shed tears of sorrow. In this way, according to what is going on in the movie, the observer of the movie undergoes similar experiences. Why so? Because the observer is identifying with the movie. The observer becomes so absorbed in the movie that he or she forgets that actually the movie is just something imaginary. The movie is not reality. It's just some things being shown on a screen. But because the observer falsely identifies with what is going on that imaginary platform, so therefore he or she shares in the enjoyments and sufferings that are depicted there in that movie. In other words, therefore, the problem is with the mind. The experiences are going on in the mind. So, therefore, accepting, rejecting, sankalpo, vikalpo, manaha. So, this accepting and rejecting is going on at the level of the mind. The soul is aloof. The soul's problem only is at one point, that it identifies with the material body. Manute pi anartham. It imagines that I am this material body, I am this material mind. So when the movie is over, then the person he emerges from the movie and back to his normal life. So this is the nature of how the so-called enjoyment and suffering is going on. And because of that imaginary identification, the mind induces the intelligence and the senses to act in certain ways to avoid suffering and to increase enjoyment. Then that generates karma, which implicates one further in the cycle of karma. And then that goes on to the cycle of birth and death. So another question may be asked then. If the soul is Satchidananda, it is fully conscious, and in the material world, the soul is actually aloof from the material body. It is not the soul that experiences the happiness and distress. It is actually the mind that is going through, the material mind. Then can the soul suffer and enjoy at all? Can the soul enjoy happiness? Yes, indeed it can. It does. That is its constitutional position. But that enjoyment of the soul is only on the spiritual platform, not on the material platform. So long as the soul is under the clutches of the illusory energy of Krishna, the soul is not able to understand its own spiritual nature, is not able to relish and taste that higher spiritual happiness. But when, by hearing from authority, Srila Prabhupada concludes that verse today by speaking about the importance of hearing from authority. So when the living entity hears spiritual instructions from the proper authorities, then he understands what is to be done, what is not to be done, and then gradually uplifts himself or herself beyond the three modes by performing Krishna conscious activity, which is on the transcendental platform. Then the soul is able to cut off that imaginary connection, that fabricated connection between itself and the material body. And now the soul is relishing relationship with Krishna. So the soul is meant to enjoy that happiness. That is the ananda. That is the constitutional position of the soul. So the soul does enjoy, but only on the spiritual realm. When the soul comes into the material realm and comes under the clutches of Maya, then the soul doesn't enjoy or suffer anymore. It just remains in a dream state. So Krishna consciousness means to wake the sleeping souls to the ultimate reality of serving and loving Krishna. Therefore, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has said, Jiva Jago, Jiva Jago. He's telling the different living entities. So, O living entity, please rise, please rise. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's instruction to all of us to awaken, Gora Chanda Bole, Koto Nidra Yao Maya Pishachira Kole. So you are sleeping in the lap of the witch Maya. So Gauranga Mahaprabhu is saying, O sleeping souls, wake up, wake up. You are meant to enjoy a higher happiness. You are not meant to enjoy and suffer and to go through these 8 experiences of bhava, nasha, karma, shoka, moha, bhaya, sukha, dukkha, etc. You're not meant to go through these 8 experiences. You're only meant for the ananda of love of Lord Krishna. So therefore, this process of bhakti yoga is described. In the verse from the Bhagavatam that I cited, Yaya sammohito jiva atmanam trigunatmakam, the very next verse says, Anarthopashamam sakshat bhakti yogam adhokshaje lokasya janato vidvams chakre satvata samhitam. In which means that anartha, that means all these unwanted things, upashamam, it is mitigated or destroyed, sakshat, directly, bhakti yogam adhokshaje, by the process of bhakti yoga to adhokshaja. Adhokshaja is another name for Lord Krishna. So simply by the process of bhakti yoga, all the misunderstandings because of which we have to go through these 8 experiences is destroyed. But unfortunately, lokasya ajanataha, the common people do not know this. Therefore, Vidvan, who is Vedavyas, Vyasadev, the greatest scholar, Chakre, he has compiled Satvata Samhitam, this very pure transcendental literature, the Srimad Bhagavatam. The only purpose of the Srimad Bhagavatam is to give us bhakti, is to lead us on the path of bhakti yoga. So therefore, by regularly reciting and hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, and it is very nice that all of you are doing it every day in the morning, you are hearing and reciting Srimad Bhagavatam, then by following this process of bhakti yoga, reading and hearing Bhagavatam, chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra regularly every day, then what will happen? Anartha upashamam sakshad. So all these anarthas will be destroyed and we will be brought to to our constitutional position wherein the soul can now actually enjoy what it is meant to enjoy, the love of Godhead. Okay, so I will stop here. Are there any questions?
Maharaj, Dandapanam. Maharaj, I just have one question. You said at the soul level, the soul can enjoy because it's Sachidananda. I was wondering, does it also undergo suffering of any kind at the spiritual level?
Okay, that's a good question. So I mentioned that in the material world, all the so-called suffering and enjoyment that happens is only happening at the level of the mind. It is a mind that experiences the happiness and suffering. A dead body doesn't experience happiness and suffering, right? Even if you give it so many impulses and stimuli, you cut it, but the dead body doesn't experience. It is because of the presence of the subtle body, the mind, that the experience of happiness and distress exists. And the mind is able to experience happiness and distress because the soul is present within. Otherwise, even the subtle body is material and is incapable of experience. So the soul is not actually directly experiencing this. It is a mind that experiences suffering and distress, and it is the soul that only enjoys at the transcendental realm, because the soul is meant to enjoy Krishna's love. So the question that has been asked now is, yes, the soul enjoys transcendental happiness in the spiritual world, but does the soul also enjoy, or does the soul also suffer? Can the soul also experience that kind of suffering? And the answer is yes, but the suffering that is experienced at the transcendental level is also non-different from spiritual bliss. Like the residents of Vrindavan experienced intense suffering in separation from Krishna. So that grief, that suffering is actually the highest level of transcendental bliss. So on the spiritual platform, therefore, the suffering is not different from bliss. It gives rise to a bliss that is even more intense. So that is the first point. The second point is that one could also speak of the suffering on the spiritual platform in the sense of feeling suffering for the conditioned living entities who are suffering in this material world. Like we see in the Bhagavatam saying for Prahlad Maharaj, who says, Naivod Vijay Paraduratya Yavaitaranyas Tadvire Gayana Mahamrita Magna Chittaha Shoche Tato Vimukha Chetasa Indriyartha Maya Sukhaya Bharamudvahato Vimudhan. So Prahlad Maharaj says that, my dear Lord, I am not at all perturbed or disturbed by the sufferings of this material world, because my consciousness is completely absorbed in glorification of your good name and pastimes and so on. I'm tasting that nectar. So I am not at all disturbed by the sufferings of this material world. But I am suffering or feeling the pain of those who have become averse to you. Shoche tataha. Shocha means shoka, dukkha. But I do lament for those people who have turned their back towards you, who are averse to you, and who are trying to enjoy the Maya Sukha, the enjoyment of this material world. So I lament for them. So therefore, the lamentation or the feeling of sadness that a pure devotee may experience is on this account. So we have two things. One is the feeling of separation from Krishna and his devotees. And second is the feeling of compassion for those who are not Krishna conscious. Yes, any other question?
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Yes.
Maharaj, I have two questions.
Yes.
Firstly, I want to know the difference between ego and false ego. And
Okay.
secondly, when a person dies, the soul carries the subtle body goes with the soul,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And false ego, if it is false, why does the soul carry?
Okay, so your first question is, what is the difference between false ego and ego? Now, the word ego means I, the sense of identity, the sense of I-ness, that I-ness, I am so and so. So that true ego, when we speak of false ego, there must be a true ego. So when the false ego is that I think I am the material body, what is the true ego? The true ego is that I understand I am the eternal spirit soul and I am part and parcel of Krishna. I am eternal servant of Krishna. So this identification, this identity, this sense of I-ness is true ego. But when the soul imagines itself to be the material body, that is false ego. So your second question is about, when this is a false ego, why does the soul carry the subtle body with it at the time of death of the gross body? The answer is that the subtle body is the vehicle through which the living entity is experiencing the enjoyment, so-called enjoyment of this world. So because the material body can last only for a short period, when this material body is no longer a suitable place to try to enjoy this world, the subtle body, under the laws of nature, is forced to leave that material body and take the soul to another suitable body under the laws of karma. So the subtle body will remain with the jiva so long as the jiva is under the clutches of false ego. But when the jiva restores itself to its original consciousness, comes out of the dream state of material consciousness, then the subtle body is left behind, it is destroyed, and the pure jiva goes to the spiritual world. Okay, one final question.
Maharaj, those who are on the higher platform, even in ISKCON, don't you think that they too have false ego?
So, well, you see, it depends. When false ego, the first step is to understand that there is something called false ego. The materialistic people do not even understand that there is something called false ego because they only think of themselves as the material body. Now, when we become devotees, at least theoretically, we understand that I am not this body, I am the spirit soul. And therefore, I must try to come out of the bodily concept of life. So therefore, we take to the process of Bhakti Yoga. And we start practicing sincerely. So we practice and practice and practice, and the years go by. After some years, then people consider us senior devotees. But you see, the false ego has stuck with us for trillions and trillions of lifetimes. It's not something that happened only yesterday. Because this material attachment and this false consciousness has stuck with us for such a long, long period of time, it is not easy to get over it just immediately. Theoretically, it is possible. If one can even chant purely one name of Krishna, it can kill millions of lifetimes of bad karma. One can become immediately situated on the platform of spiritual consciousness. However, that kind of intensity of the chanting of the holy names is not easy. So realistically speaking, the progress is steady, but it is slow. Therefore, our recovery from this dream state, our process of awakening from it, is a gradual process. It takes not one lifetime, but many lifetimes. So we can understand that we are now practicing devotional service because we have done so in several previous lives. And therefore we have come here to the point where we are now discussing Srimad Bhagavatam in such a serious way. So some of us who are more fortunate may be so advanced that this will be our last life. And for the rest of us, we should try our level best to ensure that this remains our last life. So we should, with all our intensity and sincerity, try to make this our last life. Now, it is not for us to keep judging devotees. This person is a senior devotee and still under false ego. Generally, when we speak of ego, we are speaking of a person who is very proud. That is a general connotation of the word ego in the normal everyday world. But when we speak of false ego, we speak of it in a much deeper way. That sense of pride that comes up, ahankara, is definitely a reflection of the false ego. But we are speaking of false ego at a much more fundamental level of identifying with the body. So, yes, it may appear like that some devotees who have been many years in the movement may also exhibit that attachment to the body. Sometimes they may be proud, sometimes may be less proud, some more proud. But we should know that they are rightly situated. First point. They are continuing to serve Krishna. Whether today or tomorrow or day after, they will be able to overcome their deficiencies and their attachment to the body. Number one. And number two, it is not for us to judge what we perceive as a shortcoming of other devotees. Because inasmuch as we think that others, maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong. Inasmuch as we may think of others having false ego, others may be thinking more about us like that we have so much false ego. So therefore, it is not for us to make these judgments. Even if we see some defects in somebody, we may have to deal with it, but we also understand that this person is a devotee. And because of the practice of Krishna consciousness, we'll be overcoming this in course of time. So we should still respect that devotee. We should not become very, shall we say, critical. Okay? Yes.
Maharaj, I did not mean to say anything adverse or anything, but I want to know that Prabhupada always emphasized that within this lifetime you can go to, he talks of a spiritual level which we cannot do, I know, but he emphasizes that charity will take you there.
Yes, certainly.
How do you?
And all of us are on that road. Someone is a little ahead, someone is here, someone is here, someone is here, but we're all on that path. Yes? We're all on that path back to Godhead. So never mind. Sorry?
Like you said that many lives we have crossed.
Yes.
Yet we are in this struggling state.
Yes. So it's just like when we pass out of high school, you look at the 11th standard, whatever year, I don't know what you call it in America, maybe year 11 of school or year 12, whatever it is. But when you pass out of year 12, it's not that is the only year that has mattered. You've had to put through many years before you reach year 11 or 12. And then only can you pass from your high school and go to university. So similarly, if you want to graduate from the material world and go to Krishna's abode, we may be in year 11, 12, we don't know. Somebody may be very advanced devotee, maybe on that level. Some may be in the 9th standard, some may be in the 7th, 6th, or 5th grade of school. We may all be at different levels. But once we have taken to Krishna consciousness very seriously, then we can make rapid advancement to the year 11 and year 12 of school. At least we should ensure that we are constantly moving towards that. We need not worry too much about whether I am in year 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. The important thing is that we should focus on the positive side of it, that here is a wonderful process that is given to us to perfect our lives. Let us take to it wholeheartedly and just keep doing, and we will make advancement by the grace of Guru and Krishna and the Vaishnavas. And take a positive approach, optimistic approach, and enthusiastically continue devotional service. And whether we go to Godhead at the end of this life or not is something for Krishna to judge. We leave that decision to Krishna. Okay?
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very so much. All the devotees are paying their obeisances to you, and please accept all of our humble obeisances to your lotus feet. Would you like to take a couple more questions, Maharaj? Or
Maybe one or two more?
Sure, Maharaj. Devotees, please unmute your microphone and go ahead and share your realization. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, I just have a follow-up on your answer. Can I ask?
Yes, surely.
Maharaj, you were mentioning of the Jiva Dayam, the compassion for the living entities to go back to Godhead. So I was wondering, is that also a spiritual emotion?
Yes.
The Jiva Daya which you experience?
Yes, for a pure devotee, when one has, you see, again, there are gradations. It's a gradual process. Even in the mode of goodness, there is compassion. The compassion is a sattvic quality. So even those who are not devotees of Krishna, if they have some degree of sattva guna in them, they will also feel compassion for others. But when one comes on the spiritual platform, one's compassion becomes completely spiritualized. So there is a difference between material compassion and spiritual compassion. So compassion becomes perfect when it is seen in relationship to Krishna consciousness. Because we understand that this is the ultimate compassion, this is the ultimate welfare for all living beings. So when we become devotees, we bring in a certain amount of sattva guna with us. So we all have some degree of compassion for those who are suffering. But when we become devotees, we understand that real compassion means to give them Krishna consciousness. So as we advance in Krishna consciousness, the spiritual component of our compassion becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And even the quantity of our compassion, the quality of our compassion goes on increasing. And on the completely transcendental platform, of course, one is fully compassionate. So, as devotees, we also feel that compassion towards those who are not devotees. We see suffering, we are unhappy when we see people suffering. So, then we try to see that we give them Krishna consciousness. And for a devotee, a great source of happiness is to see other people taking happiness in Krishna consciousness. So when a new person takes to Krishna consciousness and becomes joyful, there is nothing more joyful for a devotee than to see that. We become very happy to see other people becoming happy in Krishna consciousness. Yes?
Sure, Maharaj, thank you so much. So, when a devotee is like becomes completely spiritual, when the soul realizes its true position and it sheds the material mind and senses. I've also read, Maharaj, that Prabhupada says that yes, there is mind and senses in the spiritual world, but they are totally spiritual. So, do they develop a spiritual mind, or is it glorified? And that's how it goes back. I'm so sorry for.
There are three levels of senses that we have. One is the gross senses, the senses of the gross body and the subtle body, of the gross body. We have the ears. This is a sense. It's called Jnanendriya, knowledge acquiring senses. We gather information of the world around us through these senses. The ears, the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the skin. So these are gross senses, the senses of the gross body. And we utilize them to gather information. Now, does a dead body gather information even though the dead body has ears and eyes and tongue and skin? No, because the subtle body is no longer there. So the subtle body has its own senses. The sense of hearing, the sense of sight, the sense of taste, the sense of touch, the sense of smell. They exist in the subtle body as well. So the gross body senses are receptacles, and then it is the subtle body senses that actually experience. So we hear some nice music, the sound goes in through the ears, and the experience is in the mind, the subtle hearing sense of the mind. So that is the second level of the senses of the subtle body, which is also material. But those subtle senses are also able to function only because the soul is present there. And the soul also has its own senses. The soul can hear, taste, touch, smell, feel, everything. But those senses are asleep, so to speak. Just like when we are asleep and we're experiencing something in a dream, our senses of the gross body are inactive, but the mind is active. So the physical senses are asleep, so to speak. Only the subtle body is active. So in a sense like that, the soul is inactive. Its senses are not active right now. But when it is engaged in the service of Lord Krishna, then the spiritual senses get awakened. Swayam eva spuratyadaha. Ataha Shri Krishna namadi na bhaved grahyam indriyai sevon mukhehi jivado swayam eva spuratyadaha. So the spiritual realities cannot be understood by the gross senses or the subtle material senses. They can be understood by the spiritual senses. The spiritual senses can be awakened when we serve Krishna through our gross material senses and our subtle material senses. So, because we only have this to operate in the material world, so when we use our gross senses and our subtle material senses in the service of Krishna, gradually the spiritual senses are awakened. Swayam eva. Automatically it happens. Spurti, that is that inspiration or that understanding, realization, it comes from within. So the spiritual senses of the soul are awakened gradually, step by step, as we continue the Bhakti Yoga process.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. My humble obeisance. Thank you so
Devotee, Maharaj, is that okay? We have one more question, or just want to check with you.
Yeah, you can ask.
Thank you, Maharaj. Devotees, please unmute yourself, your microphones, and Please go ahead with the question or the realization that you want to share.
So, Maharaj, please accept my humble obeisances. This is Abhiram Sakadar from Charlotte.
Hare Krishna.
Maharaj, continuation of the same question. So, do we have subtle mind also? And if yes, who has a desire to enjoy in this material world? Is it a material mind or a subtle mind?
Okay, Hare Krishna, Abhiram Sakha, Prabhu. I have fond memories of being with you in 2010 in Charlotte at your home. I stayed in your home and you arranged many nice programs. And I hope you're all well there. And also your programs are going on very nicely. So your question is, who enjoys the subtle mind or the material mind? Well, you see, the subtle mind is the material mind. I talked about 3 levels of senses, yes? The senses of the gross body, the senses of the subtle body, and the senses of the soul. So, the subtle mind, we are talking about the mind of the material body, which is part of the subtle body. Mana, Buddhi, Ahankar. That's subtle body. So the everyday experiences of happiness and distress that we go through, the 8 experiences that Brahmaji speaks about in the verse that we discussed today, that is experienced by the subtle mind. The mind is subtle. It's a part of the subtle body, which is material. The soul has nothing to do with it. The soul also has its own mind. It has its own intelligence, its own sense of hearing, sight, touch, and everything. But these are lying dormant. And by the process of Bhakti Yoga, they will get awakened. Okay?
Hare Krishna Maharaj. Thank you very much for a beautiful class and nice explanation of all the questions. Maharaj, one question I have is, I think you clearly laid out how we experience happiness and distress on the mind platform. Now, as sadhakas, when we practice devotional service, we know that chanting and everything gives us happiness. We struggle through it. But sometimes, there's a sense of spiritual happiness when you get small realizations about Krishna. How do we understand if it's still on the material mind platform, or is it truly an experience of Krishna consciousness?
Good question. It may be. That's a very, shall we say, subtle question. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Rupa Goswami has dealt with a variety of such experiences. And he has distinguished the genuinely spiritual experience from the reflection of such a spiritual experience, which may be material. So, on the material platform also sometimes we may feel some happiness in doing something Krishna conscious. There may be a material component to the happiness that we feel in some Krishna conscious activity, but there is also definitely a spiritual component. Sometimes we may feel, that tasting something nice, it tastes good to the sense buds. And so we're experiencing some happiness. Is it a spiritual happiness that I experience when I'm tasting some gulab jamun? Now, the taste, yes, it appears very nectarian. So there is a material component maybe, and there is also a direct spiritual component there. So some people may be very emotional by nature, and they may get tears, during some spiritual discussion or a kirtan, but that may not always necessarily be spiritual tears. It may be just out of natural, emotional nature, which is based on the material platform. So it is hard to say. But in general, what can be said is that the more we do Krishna consciousness, we will get more and more spiritual experiences, the experience of spiritual happiness, we will get glimpses of that spiritual happiness, which comes even to a very, very new devotee. Even at the very, very beginning stages of Krishna consciousness, Krishna may give us a glimpse of that happiness. And that happiness is what actually induces us to take to the process of serving Krishna consciousness, of serving Krishna. The kind of ecstasy and bliss a person feels when he or she comes to Krishna consciousness is the taste that Krishna gives. It's genuine spiritual bliss. But then gradually Krishna may withdraw it a little bit and ensure that we have what it takes to continue in our devotional service lifelong. So yes, to answer your question, there will definitely be a spiritual component whenever we perform devotional service. To the extent there is some material component to that, it depends. Devotee to devotee, it may change. But nonetheless, if we are experiencing happiness from doing devotional service, no problem. We should continue doing it. And the spiritual component will keep rising. Okay, so I think we'll stop here. It's quite long. It's more than 1.5 hours since we've been here. So thank you all very much, and I'm happy I got the opportunity to serve all of you by discussing some Srimad Bhagavatam. And I hope and pray that all of you will continue to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam and practice Krishna consciousness with full enthusiasm. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.
And we are very, very grateful to you. We look forward for your association again in the future, Maharaj. Let's all pray our obeisances to Maharaj.
Hare Krishna. Jai.